Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Great Reassessment Podcast. I am your host, Matthew Mastronardi. Really excited to have today's guest on the show and talk about a lot of important things. And so, Professor Mark David Hall, thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
So, Professor Hall has written a number of books. I have two of them here with me today. The first one is Did America Have a Christian Founding? And then the second one is Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land. You've written many more books. Your most recent one, Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism? And then one here I see before this is America and the Just War Tradition. So there's a lot of books we could talk about. I kind of want to keep today's conversation in this vein, though, between these two books, if that's okay. And so tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got into it.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of politics. I primarily do political theory, constitutional law, especially in the American context. So a lot of religious liberty, church-state relations, and that sort of thing. And when you do that, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it crystal clear that we must interpret the First Amendment in light of its generating history, in light of the founders' original understanding of what these phrases meant. And so this has led me to do a lot of historical work, even though I'm a political scientist. Most of these two books especially are primarily historical. And so getting back to look at questions such as what are the religious beliefs of the American founders? What was their understanding of the Establishment Clause? Did they intend to strictly separate church and state? Is the Constitution godless? So I've spent a lot of time addressing these sorts of issues.
One of the founders you reference a lot in both books is Roger Sherman.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you that growing up in going through high school, even in college, I never knew who Roger Sherman was. Tell us a little bit about who he is and why he's important to the conversation.
Yeah, happy to do so. So actually, this has sort of been a theme of my professional life. When Americans think of the founding fathers, usually only 5 or 6 people come to mind. The 4 who became president, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, probably a Ben Franklin, and then maybe an Alexander Hamilton, thanks primarily to the recent play about him. And so one of the things I've attempted to do is expand the conversation to suggest that there are a lot of other founders, maybe not quite as important as the ones that immediately come to mind, but still critically important, who played an important role in drafting the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, in some cases a more important role than the famous founders, and Roger Sherman is one of these. So he's a cobbler from Connecticut who became an attorney, spent more time in the Continental Confederation Congress than almost anyone. He was on the 5-person committee that put together the Declaration of Independence. He was a key participant in the Constitutional Convention and a key author of the Bill of Rights. And this is something that really is not true of any other founder, and yet no one knows of Sherman. And so I attempted to shine some light on him, addressing his political theology, really.
Yeah, and he was a Christian. Is that right?
Yeah, so virtually every founder would have identified himself or herself as a Christian. And as far as we can tell, almost all of them were theologically orthodox. We know a handful were not, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, for instance. But certainly someone like a Sherman was a Calvinist. Calvinist? Yeah, I think that's right. So his pastor was Jonathan Edwards Jr., the son of the famous Jonathan Edwards. The guy wrote sermons. He debated with John Witherspoon the appropriate criteria whereby a Christian might get a divorce. He wrote and preached sermons. Yeah, so a very serious Calvinist and Orthodox Christian, and someone whose faith clearly impacted his contributions to the founding of the American Republic.
That's awesome. Yeah, in Did America Have a Christian Founding, I really enjoyed how you talked he was highly influential too. He was not a junior delegate. He actually influenced a lot of the decisions that went into the framing of the Constitution and shut down a couple of Madison's propositions. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And Madison was a great American founder, and I don't want to take anything away from him. But we sometimes simplistically say that Madison is a father of the American Constitution. And I don't even want to take that label away from him. But if you look at what he actually proposed in the Virginia plan, he wanted to give Congress a plenary grant of power. That is, Congress could do whatever it wanted to, whatever it thought was necessary. Sherman arrived in Philadelphia a couple of days late. And to paraphrase him, he basically said, "You're crazy. This is insane. We can't give Congress unlimited power." And he proposed what eventually became Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that is an enumeration of Congress's powers. Congress shall only have the power to do a relatively limited number of things, very important things: declare war, international relations, post office, regulation of interstate commerce. But everything else the governments might do, and today do, education, punishing criminals, and that sort of thing, those will be left up to the states or the localities. The national government shouldn't have anything to do with it. Now, since 1936, we've blown that part of the Constitution up, unfortunately. And I think Sherman and many of the founders would be very distraught by that. But yeah, so Sherman played a very important role in creating the Constitution and creating the Bill of Rights. He was a member of the first federal Congress. He and Madison went back and forth on a number of things, and he won more than he lost.
Why do you think today the question, did America have a Christian founding, is so important? It really, there's a lot of people out there who seems like they've made it their life goal to convince everybody that America did not have a Christian founding. And then you have other people who are proud of America's history who want to keep that. And now there's this tension. What do you think are the main reasons for that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. And I do answer the question of the book, Did America Have a Christian Founding, with the resounding yes. I think it did. I do distinguish that from America being founded as a Christian nation. I don't like that phrasing. It sounds too exclusive, as if America was founded by and for Christians only, and maybe we'll tolerate non-Christians, maybe we won't. I think that's entirely false. Clearly, the founders of the Constitution thought America should be a nation for anyone, regardless of their religious convictions. Why does it matter? I think the founders' views still matter, whether you're on the left or the right. If you're on the right, it's perhaps a bit more intuitive. We respect history. We want to claim that the founders are on our side. And so if you're a Christian, it's tempting to say that, yeah, of course, America had a Christian founding. All of the founders were good, godly men and women, explicitly trying to create a Christian commonwealth. And so popular Christian historians regularly argued this, and they overstate their claims. And I think it actually makes it difficult for someone like me who's trying to make more nuanced claims. On the other hand, if you're on the left, you want to say America's founders were deists who created a godless constitution and wanted the strict separation of church and state. So again, even if you're on the left, you're going to appeal to the founders, and yet you're going to try to remake them in your image. And so what I attempt to do in both of these books is make a more nuanced argument. I think Christianity had a very, very important influence on America's founders, even those founders who were not Orthodox Christians, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. And it led them to create a constitutional order that I think is very healthy and very useful for everyone, whether or not you're a person of faith or not, or of a non-Christian faith.
Yeah. And I think you did a good job. And it makes perfect sense that, even for those like the Jeffersons and the Franklins who were deists, they were still brought up in a culture that was highly Christianized. And so it indirectly, directly influenced a lot of their thoughts, a lot of, their morality. And so in that sense, it's still, even through them, Christian virtues were being laid at the foundation.
Yeah, I think that's right. A good example of this, and his religious beliefs are very opaque. If anyone ever tells you they know exactly what James Madison believed, you should look at them very quizzically. But in Federalist 51, for instance, he writes, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. But men aren't angels, and therefore we need government. And because men aren't angels, we need the separation of powers and checks and balances. And then he goes on to Federalist 51 to lay these out. And this is a very important insight. I think every American founder, including a Thomas Jefferson and a Ben Franklin, had a view of human nature that said humans are sinful or perhaps selfish, and therefore we need to be very careful of concentrated powers. We need to divide power between the national government and the states and have separation of powers, checks and balances, and on and on. On the other hand, Enlightenment thinkers at the time, at least members of the radical Enlightenment, had an optimistic view of human nature. And they thought that we needed a strong central government run by the experts. America's founders, fortunately, were influenced by Christian ideas, and that influence led them to go in exactly the opposite direction. In Proclaim Liberty, I talk about how the founders' views that all humans are created in the imago Dei led many of them, in the image of God, led many of them to oppose slavery. And something like 8 states voluntarily abolished slavery between 1776 and 1806 or so. And so that was a very important way in which America's founders and civic leaders in the early American Republic were influenced by Christian ideas to oppose this evil, horrendous institution.
Yeah, it was interesting to learn that I forget the exact years you talk about in the book, but the rates at which free men were progressing and growing was actually outpacing the number of new slaves during that time. And so was that because people were granting, like, emancipating their slaves, or just the entire institution as a whole was slowing down?
Yeah, pretty much almost every civic leader in the 1780s was coming to recognize that slavery was an evil institution that had to be ended. And the question was, how would it be ended? A number of the states, they tended to be mid-Atlantic or northern states, passed laws gradually emancipating slaves. And so throughout the 1780s, the 90s, into the 19th century, slavery is coming to an end in those states. But even in the South, most everyone recognized that slavery was an evil institution. Thomas Jefferson famously talked about slavery being a slave owner, being in the same position as a man holding a wolf by its ears. Now, you clearly don't want to be in that position. On the other hand, you don't want to let that wolf go because then it will attack you, right? So he understood the evils of slavery, but he wasn't sure how to end it. And throughout his life, he believed that gradual emancipation was the proper way, and yet practically the logistics of this were just too difficult. Now, unfortunately, Eli Whitney came along and invented the cotton gin in the early 1790s, and this made short staple cotton, I think it was, more profitable. And short staple cotton can be grown away from the oceans, that is in the interior of the American South. And so cotton production exploded. Even though the cotton gin saved a lot of labor, you still needed a lot of human labor to plant the cotton and harvest the cotton, that sort of thing. And so slavery got a new lease on life, although still it wasn't until the 1820s that anyone defended slavery as a positive good, as a good institution. Before the 1820s, though, it was always defended, to the extent to which it was defended, as a necessary evil. And that's just, it's a horrendous shame, of course, but it's a good example that the founders were right. Humans are sinful. And I think what you see in the American South is people's sinful inclinations. Their greed overcame their reasonable impulse that slavery is an evil.
I've thought about that. Like, somebody today might think, oh, well, the perfect remedy would have been free all the slaves, like, overnight. What would happen in a society, former slaves who didn't have a chance to get assimilated back into society? Is that actually a net positive if you have hundreds of thousands of former slaves who are now uneducated? They never had a chance to get educated or learn how to read, and have no connections, maybe nowhere to go, rather than a gradual process of emancipating slowly and gradually, like, re-assimilating people back into society.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And of course, I think you and I probably both agree that would have been the ideal solution, to free all the slaves right away in 1776 or 1789 or whenever. But those who are living and engaged in politics in this era, they were struggling with these sorts of questions. So you have this large mass of people who are illiterate. And Jefferson writes explicitly in his notes on the states of Virginia, they have very good reasons to be mad at white people, right? And so they might end up attacking white people, and you have the instances of slave rebellions. And so there was a real question, and that's why probably in the North you could end slavery because there are relatively few slaves. So it's a small percentage of the population. Now, there still is a lot of people. I think something like 100,000 people were freed in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, but that's a fraction of the population there. Whereas you get to the American South and you have up to 50% of a population of, I think, South Carolina being African Americans. So it's a very different kettle of fish. So the most common view, the ideal view was, well, let's ship the slaves back to Africa, and then they can be free, and yet they won't be a problem for us white people. But that was just logistically nowhere near possible. Of course, we did a little bit of that, founded the country of Liberia, shipped some slaves back, but it was a tiny fraction of the slaves, and slaves are reproducing. And so for every slave shipped off to Liberia, you probably have 3 slaves replacing that person. And so just never a realistic possibility. The way we ended up in slavery, of course, was a bloody civil war and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And yet that didn't solve the problem. You then have the reinstitution of slavery through other means, Jim Crow legislation, racism, structural racism, well into the 20th and into the 21st century. So that wasn't necessarily the best possible solution. There are countries, in fact, you had slavery throughout the globe. Only in 3 countries was slavery ended through a bloody war. The United States and Haiti and one other, I forget which one. In other states, in other countries like Brazil, it was ended peacefully. And one could imagine ways in which you free the slaves, compensate the former slave owners, and then institute programs of re-education and that sort of thing. That would make it a far better way to end slavery. But again, it's easy for us in the 21st century to look back and say, this is what Americans should have done. If you're actually a civic leader in the late 18th, early 19th century, it wouldn't be quite as obvious.
Yeah, that is like today, people, it's really hard to have conversations about history and specifically slavery because it's so emotionally charged that there's no room for nuance when it's like this is actually a incredibly complex situation. And the Civil War, for example, like I don't take the position that it was fought simply on the grounds of slavery. Like there were many other factors, especially at the beginning of the war. Is that a take you would agree with?
There are other factors to be sure, but I don't think we would have had a civil war if not for the issue of slavery. So you have states' rights and tariffs and other issues. But fundamentally, I do think the war was about slavery. And yet slavery could have been addressed. So something, I used to have these facts right before me. I know for sure 800,000 people were killed in the American Civil War from the North and the South. I think it's something like $60 billion worth of property was destroyed. And if you were to calculate the worth of all the slaves, and it's horrible to talk about that, but if you were to calculate the worth of all the slaves in 1859, it was something like $4 billion. And so this suggests a possible compromise, compensate slave owners with the value of twice their slaves, right? And so this might give them an incentive to say, okay, fine, we'll be done with slavery. And it would have saved a lot of money. So looking at it from hindsight, we can say slavery could have been addressed in other ways other than a bloody civil war. But unfortunately and tragically, it took a civil war to end slavery. But you're right, it's a complicated issue. Now, I do think it's clear as can be that chattel slavery is practiced in America is morally wrong. I also think it's clear as can be that abortion is practiced in America today is morally wrong. And yet, for you and I, we both know that abortion seems really complicated. You have lots of our fellow citizens who think it's a constitutional right or a moral right. And as we address this, I would love to see a federal law banning all abortions throughout all of America except to save the life of a mother. But that's just not a political reality. And so instead, what we have to do is try to think of creative ways to address what I certainly think is a moral evil, and yet to recognize that simply abolishing it, especially in the states of Washington and Oregon, overnight, that is not going to happen. And so we have to take the steps that we can take, even though it sure seems morally obvious. And hopefully 100 years from now, everyone agree that's as more obviously morally wrong as slavery was 200 years ago.
Yeah. So I've been seeing this discussion kind of float around, and as we kind of transition out of the slavery topic, um, the topic of labor hierarchies. Do you? So somebody today might say, yes, slavery existed because labor hierarchies are a constant of human history, and the only reason it doesn't exist today is because of technology. But relatively speaking, somebody working for $6 or $7 an hour for a CEO who makes, I don't know, however many billions. And just for the record, I'm not against billionaires by any imagination, but just relatively speaking, the labor it requires, just to make ends meet in today's society, working a minimum wage job for a large corporation, that these disparities, these labor hierarchies will always be present no matter what. But it's just technology, and it's no longer economically rational to own another human being. And just, there is, the views have shifted, but generally, like, the positionally, it's not any different.
Yeah, so I'm actually rereading. I have it right before me. Guns, Germs, and Steels by Jared Diamond. And it's a real useful perspective throughout almost all of human history, the vast majority of human history, the vast majority of humans barely get by. They barely have enough food to live from one year to the other, and oftentimes they don't have that, and so they die. And because of a variety of things, including, I'd say especially the introduction of Christianity and then capitalism into the West and then spreading throughout the world, we now have an abundance of goods. And so, frankly, it does not bother me at all that Bill Gates has a lot more money than I do. I mean, a ton more money. I mean, if you measured the two of us, we're like this. But you know what? I have plenty of food. I have a roof over my head. I have clothing. I have vacations. And so it's just merely jealousy if I get uptight that Bill Gates has more money than I do. Now, of course, there are people that are less fortunate than either you or I who need help. Homeless people and so forth. Obviously, this is a problem. We don't live in a utopia, and all individuals, all citizens, but especially Christians, I think, have an obligation to look out for the least of these, working through their churches, working through civic organizations, and yes, sometimes even the government needs to get involved in helping people who are unable to help themselves. But still, the vast majority of Americans who work minimum wage jobs or blue-collar jobs are far better off than almost any humans throughout all of history. And so, yeah, I have a boss, so there's a hierarchy there, but I don't think that's a particular reason to complain.
Mm-hmm. What do you see things, if the founders could reincarnate themselves for 5 minutes today and take a look at the state of things, do you think that they would look at the way the federal government is operating and say, what do you think they would say?
I think they would be horrified. Maybe a James Wilson, maybe an Alexander Hamilton would say, yes, finally, strong centralized government, the president with enormous power. But the vast majority would say, this is insane. The national government has far too much power. We've blown away the limitations from Article 1, Section 8. The national government gets to do almost anything it wants. And the administrative state, that is a president acting through administrative orders, executive orders, it has far, far, far too much power. Now, that's not an anti-government argument. I think the founders understood that governments are necessary. They just would not want to see so much governmental power in the national government. They would think many things done by the national government, education, the punishment of criminals, the helping of poor people, these things should be done through state governments or local governments, not the national government. And that's an important check on government. That is, the national government to have it limited in power. So yeah, I think almost all of them would be absolutely horrified by the amount of power that the national government has today.
Mm-hmm. I recently read a book by Tom Woods. It was called Nullification, and kind of lays out, what's currently happening is that the government today has a monopoly on deciding what is constitutional. So even though the Supreme Court has a check on the executive and legislative branch, it's, they're still part of the federal arm.
Mm-hmm.
And so the federal government has no outside checks, whereas before, especially like the 20th century, the states were a little bit more robust and would pass ordinances of nullification, or they would just simply would not recognize an unconstitutional law. And sometimes the federal government would withdraw that law. And so do you think that that is something that needs to make a resurgence, is states kind of growing in their, what do we want to call it, guts to stand off with the federal government again? Like, not to hope, and to not do it just willy-nilly, but through deliberative bodies, and not to just hey, we don't like this law, we're going to declare it unconstitutional, but to have that tool in their tool belt to say, you know what, hey, this is unconstitutional, we're not going to, I'm sorry, it's null and void. Do you think that would help with the federal government's being oversized and it's, anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. As Tom Woods points out, you have a long and distinguished history of this, right? Congress passes Alien and Sedition Acts that seemed, from our point of view, to clearly infringe upon freedom of speech. Virginia and Kentucky passed resolutions basically saying that's unconstitutional. We aren't going to have anything to do with that. You have New England states doing something similarly with respect to the War of 1812. Unfortunately, and maybe it is unfortunate, that I think secession and nullification have been so thoroughly wrapped up with the American Civil War and the South seceding from the Union, and then with Southern resistance to civil rights legislation in the 20th century, that it just almost made those doctrines unpalatable to most people. They probably shouldn't be, but I think I would not spend a lot of time, effort, and energy trying to resurrect them today. I would instead spend my time and energy trying to elect members of Congress and presidents of the United States that have a more constitutional view of the role of the federal government, and hopefully, again, dial back the scope of the national government, turning things over to the states. I think we've seen some wonderful movements toward school choice, for instance, that are led by the states. If Donald Trump can do anything, ending the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, getting the national government out of the business of education altogether, turning all the money that we spend at the national level to education over to the states, and then letting the states decide what to do, I think our states, Washington and Oregon, will make horrible decisions, but many states, Arizona, Alabama, Missouri, will make good decisions and will be far better off than having bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. trying to tell schools how to educate children throughout the nation.
Yeah, I recently toured a classical Christian school across the state line over in Idaho, and I think they are charging somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a year for tuition, and the average cost per pupil here in Washington State is about almost about $20,000. And I just saw what these kids were able to perform and the things that they're memorizing, and when they are speaking and sharing their views on, one of the books they were reading was Boethius. These are 10th graders reading really old literature, and they're understanding it. And for a fraction of the cost, if there was school choice and parents could, the money followed the student, they could easily send their kids. Even if one state was not, making the decisions that we would deem right for, some of the smaller communities, individual parents might have some freedom to send their kids to some of these better schools.
Yeah, I think that's right. Back when I used to teach Introduction to American Government, every time I taught federalism, I would pull out a chart of spending per pupil state by state, and there's a wide variation. Back when I was doing this, it probably went from 6,000 to about 20,000, but this was 20 years ago. And then I would pull out, there's a variety of tests you could look at, but basically test of educational outcomes. And what you would see is that spending per student had almost no impact on the educational outcomes. Of the top 10 states in terms of spending, only one of these states was in the top 10 of outcomes. Utah, I think, was last in spending and top in outcomes, which suggests that a lot of other things go into play. And this is just almost solely looking at public schools. If you were to take into account private schools, especially classical Christian schools, I think you'd see even greater disparities. Yes, I'm a big fan of school choice. It's constitutionally permissible to have this today. A number of states have made very great strides in that direction, and it's a trend that I hope will continue. Again, and the national government only spends about 8% of what we spend on education at K through 12 level. And so it's not even a lion's share. But then, of course, with the spending comes requirements and bureaucracy and that sort of thing. So we'd be far better off just to get the national government out of this business altogether, turn it back to the states where it belongs, and then states can turn it back to the parents, ideally, where education really should fundamentally, at the last resort, belong.
Yeah, a majority of these costs, just from, having spent some time in education, in the public schools, I mean, a lot of it just goes not directly to the student's education. It's administrative costs, athletics, it's furniture, the next latest tech with new smart boards. Like, a lot of it just gets spent on those sorts of things, and it doesn't even actually go towards developing curriculum or hiring the most quality teachers. Sometimes it's just random stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Especially administration. I've seen charts of this. It's just at every level, including private colleges, to be sure. The percentage of money spent on administrators is skyrocketing. And so, yeah, I think on balance, if you were to compare private schools with public schools, I'm sure the private schools are far, far, far more efficient and probably spend a much higher percentage towards education. So, yeah, education choice is the way to go. There's no question about that.
Kind of bringing it back to our original discussion, I want to ask you, who is your favorite founder? If you can pick one.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. It's a hard question. So someone like George Washington, I think we can agree, was an indispensable founder, the greatest founder, who did more to help create America's constitutional order than anyone else. But I have a soft spot for these lesser-known founders. My first book was on a guy named James Wilson, who, again, almost no one knows about, but a very important thinker, an early Supreme Court justice. I don't agree with everything he desired politically, but still a very interesting person. Roger Sherman, I very much appreciate his view of what the national government should and shouldn't do. So probably I would say Sherman is maybe my favorite founder, but I wouldn't presume to argue he's the most important founder. That label would have to go to George Washington, maybe in second or third place, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. But yeah, Sherman is someone who I think I personally like quite a bit.
Yeah. I just read this in your book, and you mentioned two documents that I had never heard of before. I was wondering if you could elaborate on those a little bit. The first one was the Declaration and Resolves, and the second one is the Articles of Association, and, the 1774, 1776 documents, because everybody knows the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, but these are two documents that Roger Sherman both signed, and I have no idea what the heck those are.
Yeah, so you can look them up easily enough. Basically, the Declaration of Resolves are a list of grievances against Parliament, the things Parliament is doing that we believe to be violating our rights, constitutional and natural. And it was an important early statement. And it's important to recognize there are a lot of documents like that. Now, for obvious reasons, public school teachers, private school teachers have limited time. And so when you consider the vast range of documents from the American War for Independence, the Declaration of Independence is going to stand out like a shining light. Focus on that. But there really were a lot of documents of this nature written at the state and national level. And those are important to consider, especially if you're more in the scholarly realm, because they highlight different concerns. And one of the things I point to is that many of these documents are explicitly speaking from a Christian perspective, even a Protestant perspective. And yet when you get to the Declaration of Independence, those sorts of concerns, that sort of language almost completely disappears, because the key audience for the Declaration of Independence is a Roman Catholic king of France. And so obviously you're going to be speaking as Protestants if you want the King of France to come in on your side, as he eventually did. And so just for a matter from the perspective of getting history right, we need to know about these documents. The Articles of Association are basically just an early form of agreement between how the colonies are going to interact. That, of course, was eventually superseded by the Articles of Confederation, which was eventually superseded by the Constitution. So there's no real reason practically that we should spend a lot of time with those. But I do highlight that because Roger Sherman is the only person involved in helping to write and to the extent to which they were signed these documents. And again, as I pointed out earlier, you can include he was on the 5-person committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. That he was a key participant in the Philadelphia Convention and a member of the First Federal Congress, where he helped draft the Bill of Rights. So yeah, Sherman's the only guy involved in all of that. Someone like a Jefferson, for instance, critically involved in drafting the Declaration of Independence, but he wasn't even in America when the Constitution was drafted or ratified. And same thing with the Bill of Rights. He played no role in that. And so we need to understand, even as we might say Jefferson is more important than Sherman, and I think that's probably correct, but when we're talking about whose views matter with respect to the First Amendment, clearly a Roger Sherman is more important than a Thomas Jefferson on that limited point.
Yeah. So Jefferson is often quoted, his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, where that phrase, a high wall of separation of church and state, sort of that language is introduced into the average conversation. And since then, you have people out there saying, oh, well, you can't do that because it's a violation of church and state. That's a violation of church and state. Oh, you can't put this cross here because it's a violation of church and state. Where are people being misled with this whole doctrine of church and state?
Yeah, basically it began in 1947 with the case of Everson versus the Board of Education, where Hugo Black for the majority and Wiley Rutledge for the dissent. In that case, both agreed that we must interpret the First Amendment in light of the founders' views, but then they make the mistake. They go on to say that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison represent the American founders, and their views are represented by this letter to the Danbury Baptist Association and by Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, both of which are pretty separationist sort of documents. And so this led to the court spending 50 years trying to figure out exactly how this wall of separation between church and state should work. But if you think just for a second about the wording of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It doesn't say anything about a wall of separation between church and state. That's a metaphor. And it's a metaphor that doesn't represent those words well. A wall, by definition, is a bilateral barrier. It keeps the state out of the business of the church, but it also keeps the church out of the business of the state, whereas the Establishment Clause is a unilateral barrier. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So right away, we should see that this wall metaphor is not very useful for reflecting what those words mean. And I would suggest that the words really are pretty much self-interpreting. Basically, they say that Congress will not create an established church. We won't have a national church. But otherwise, there's all sorts of ways that the government, even the national government, can encourage religion. Presidents can issue calls for prayer and fasting. The U.S. government can put scripture or religious images on monuments and that sort of thing. This began almost right away, and it continues to the present day. Now that the Establishment Clause has been applied to the states, by the same token, states can have monuments of the Ten Commandments on the State House grounds and that sort of thing. Perfectly constitutional. Yes, I think, fortunately, over the last 20 years, the court has largely gotten away from that bad history. It's instead focused more on the actual original understanding of the Establishment Clause, which, again, I think basically means that a national government, and by extension, the state governments, will not have official state churches. But otherwise, there's lots of things they can do to encourage or support religion and religious institutions. And we can argue about which of these are prudential in today's very diverse times, but many of these things are constitutional, such as the things you mentioned, religious images on public land and that sort of thing. And let me be clear, by the way, that in the 21st century, this oftentimes includes non-Christian images, Stars of David on state Holocaust memorials and that sort of thing. And these things are clearly constitutional. So saying there isn't a wall of separation between church and state is not to say that states should favor Christianity above other religions. I'm a Christian, but I think this is a horrible idea, and states ought not to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, it seems obvious to me that, if you just the word Congress, it applies only to them. And, even before, my understanding is that, there were several states that would use publicly gathered tax dollars to fund churches, like in Massachusetts, Connecticut, I think, use tax dollars to support. Like, I don't see how it would be a violation if a church, if a state, even today, wanted to have a state church. If the citizens of that state said they wanted to do it, I don't think that would be a violation, because it just applies to Congress.
The U.S. Supreme Court, using the 14th Amendment, which does clearly restrict the states, began the process of applying the Bill of Rights to the states in 1896. Yeah, I think that's right. But then really picking up speed in 1925 with the freedom of speech and so forth. And so this doctrine, which is known as incorporation, has been around over 100 years. And as a conservative, I guess I'm not prepared to say we should throw it out the window. I think it was an ill-conceived doctrine. And so basically I agree with you that certainly as the First Amendment was written, states should be completely free to have established churches if they want. But since we have applied, the U.S. Supreme Court has applied the Bill of Rights to the states, I think we're kind of stuck with that. But again, it does almost nothing. It means that the state of Washington, the state of Alabama cannot have an official established state church. That's about it. The state of Washington or the state of Alabama can fund private Christian schools, private Jewish day schools. It can have monuments of the Ten Commandments on public land. And, there's plenty of things that states can do. But yeah, this doctrine of incorporation, I think it was ill-conceived. I think it was wrong, but I think we're stuck with it.
Yeah, you said 1925. I think, wasn't the name of that case like Gelzo versus
Gitlow versus New York.
New York. Yeah. I've kind of went on a 2-week studying, dive on the whole doctrine of incorporation. It's very complex. It's very confusing, because you have a case in 1880 something, Barron v. Baltimore, where the Supreme Court said to a resident of the state of Maryland, they're like, sorry, we can't help you because eminent domain doesn't apply to the state. It's only the federal government that cannot take your land without just compensation. But if your state constitution allows for that, then sorry. So yeah, the entire Bill of Rights, nobody, even, the Supreme Court at that time, did not believe that they could incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states.
Sure. So that was a case from the 1820s.
1820s.
And again, I think that's absolutely right. Again, the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting. And I think that Congress covers everything in the Bill of Rights. It's only with the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which includes phrasing along the lines that no state shall ... And then through the Due Process Clause, the court selectively applied the Bill of Rights to the states beginning in 1896, 1925. The Everson versus Board of Education applied the Establishment Clause to the states. Again, as a conservative, it's complicated for me. I think the doctrine was wrong, but it's also been around for so very long that I think it would be a mistake to throw it out the window at this point of time. But I have plenty of conservative friends who disagree with me, who think we should throw it out. And sometimes bad precedents should be thrown out, just as Roe versus Wade was thrown out, and appropriately so, in my opinion.
Yeah, when I was at the National Right to Life convention in Atlanta, when they, because that's always in June, and that's typically when a lot of those massive cases get released. And yeah, you had the same people or not the same people, but people were making the same argument. 50 years of precedent, or this however many years of precedent. So yeah, you got to be wise about it, but it just depends on the situation.
Well, one of the differences, I think, is almost right away people questioned the validity of Roe versus Wade, and it really was kind of wild reasoning. And then in 1992, the U.S. Supreme Court pretty much said, yeah, the reasoning of Roe versus Wade is wrong, but the outcome was okay, so we'll stick with it. And again, you had a huge amount of controversy for all 50 of those years. Um, Whereas I just don't know, outside of a few principled conservative academics, no one's running around saying the doctrine of incorporation is wrong. States should be able to restrict the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the free exercise of religion. Again, almost no one holds that view. And so I think that's a way in which we can distinguish between these incorporation precedents in Roe versus Wade or other kind of crazy decisions of the Warren Court era.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Um, so you teach at Regents University. Over the years, what has been your impression of like the overall caliber of student? Are students graduating from high school prepared to enter university, or like what's kind of been the your anecdotal evidence over the last 10 years or so with respect to that?
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like a curmudgeonly old man, but I think clearly well, by almost any measure, people are graduating from high school with less of an ability to read carefully, to think well, to write well. I think technology explains a lot of this. Young people are distracted by phones and maybe a couple decades ago, video games and television and this sort of thing. And now with the ability to go to AI to write papers, they aren't learning to write. Again, this is a broad generalization. I still teach excellent students that are any bit as sharp as the best students that I went to school with back in the day. But yeah, I think largely technology has ruined education for many students, which isn't to say they aren't capable of recovering from that. It's one of the things my wife and I sacrificed tremendously to send our children to private classical Christian schools, and I think that sort of investment is well worth the time. And it was a school that even a decade ago they were telling students you can't bring your cell phones into the classroom. We're going to read great text where you're going to write essay exams and that sort of thing. The school wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a heck of a lot better than what goes on in many schools, um, public and private today.
So I work in a high school, and just it seems like, and so I wasn't around teaching 10 years ago, but man, it's just hard to get these kids off their phones sometimes.
Yeah, even the state of Oregon, I was reading just the other day, passed a policy basically banning cell phones in classes. And so everyone's starting to recognize that this is a problem. It just takes a will to say, no, you don't get cell phones. Probably a decade ago, I started banning laptops in my classes. They could be used for legitimate purposes, for taking notes or looking up a fact. But I think the reality is they were distracting most students. And even if you weren't using a laptop, if you're sitting behind someone that does, that could be distracting you. So yeah, I'm not a fan of technology in the classroom. There might be ways of using things like AI in a profitable way, but I don't think it's any substitute for reading difficult text, writing your own papers, and thinking through arguments. Yeah, it's very problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty active on social media, and it's amazing how a lot of these apps get to know you, and they show you one video that might seem perfectly fine by itself, but like the way it can just suck you in with the algorithms, and before you know it, they call it like death scrolling. You're scrolling, and 20 minutes has gone by, and you can feel the effects on your own brain. Like, man, I just feel like I need to go read a book or something to undo this. And some of these high schoolers, they'll spend 3-4 hours in like at a time, just in that world, not thinking. They're getting constant, dopamine hits every 3 to 4 seconds, because that's on average like how long these videos are before they scroll to the next one. And I think it's really impaired, young teenagers with to not be able to think when they're in class, and to
Yeah.
read a more than a few pages. So
No, I think that's right. I agree.
mm-hmm. As we kind of wrap up here, something that I try to make it a goal of this podcast is to explore what I think is somewhat of an awakening happening in the broader culture. Not necessarily a revival or a religious awakening, but there seems to be this resurgence in thinking for oneself. People are losing trust in mainstream institutions. And what that's kind of caused is sort of a renaissance for people who really like to think for themselves, whether it's health and diet guidelines, medical advice, news, mainstream news publications, and you see people be growing less and less reliant on the wisdom of all those old mainstream institutions, whereas now people are sort of they've lost complete trust, and now they're taking matters into their own hands a little bit, and people are sharing ideas are spreading from truly grassroots sources. And so I'm wondering if you've sort of felt that just as you are living, in the world, and what do you think of it? And are you optimistic about the future?
Yeah, I do tend to be an optimist, and I see some of what you're talking about. I think clearly this last election cycle, maybe the last 4 years, has caused many Americans to question what we used to call the mainstream media, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the internet's allowed the proliferation of all sorts of views and websites and whatnot. So I guess my fear is that people are leaving NBC and they're going to Joe Rogan or something like that. And I'm not sure, I'm not actually particularly critical of him. I'm not really listening to him, but I'm not sure that he's maybe a more reliable source than NBC. And same with the medical advice, right? I can't tell you how many friends I have that have rejected kind of mainstream medical advice, but then they have completely opposite views, right? Eat no carbs, eat only carbs, and so forth and so on. So on balance, I guess I'm optimistic to the extent to which people are turning to Christianity, to the extent to which they're turning towards classical Christian education. I think it's a very good thing. I'm just not sure how widespread it is, but I pray that it becomes widespread. And to the extent to which it is becoming widespread, that would be a cause for hope.
Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of young people who are turning to Christianity and Roman Catholicism, and because they are sort of seeing a lot of the shallowness that is existing in this secular world, and there's this inner desire for something serious, something sacred. And so I even see a lot of non-Christians who are sort of rediscovering the timeless truths of family building. They're not necessarily Christians, but they're all of a sudden desiring monogamous, faithful marriage between a man and a woman, and they want to produce offspring. And it's those are godly attributes. And I'm just wondering, not that you have to be a Christian to do that, but that's something that historically has always, been very, closely tied to Christianity. And it's obviously what's prescribed in the New Testament. But it's just fascinating that people are finding this wisdom just kind of all over the place, and there seems to be a hunger out there for this type of thing.
Yeah, I think some of this is maybe a result of the overreach of the far left progressives. I think lots of people in the middle just think it makes no sense to have gender mutilating surgeries on 7-year-olds or letting men compete against women in high school sports. They just see the results of this and they say, this is insane. Now, people on the far left are always going to support this, I presume. People on the far right have always said this is insane, but I think a lot more people in the middle are trying to say this is crazy. Similarly, a lot of people have been hurt by divorce, and so children of divorce might recognize, yeah, this is not a good thing. And stable families make a lot of sense. I think you make an interesting comment. I think even within Christianity, that the more traditional manifestations of Christianity, Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, maybe Presbyterianism, have seen a resurgence. I'm an Anglican myself, a member of the Anglican Church in North America, and this is a denomination that's been growing by leaps and bounds, whereas a mainstream, more liberal, progressive denomination such as the Episcopalian Church, the PCUSA, is declining. And frankly, I see this sort of thing as being hopeful, that people are being drawn to orthodox manifestations of Christianity rather than the heretical ones that became way too common in the mid 20th century.
Yeah, it's like people's spidey senses for wokeness have gotten really well calibrated. And
Yep.
so now it's like they can sniff it out, even if it's kind of hidden in Christianity or in, whatever it may be. And it's like people, I just think they're fed up with that, and that postmodernism is dying a little bit.
No, I think that's right. Even corporate America is recognizing that a company like Boeing should focus on building planes and not being maybe so concerned about racial diversity. I think racial diversity is not a bad thing. I certainly think Boeing shouldn't discriminate on the basis of race, but the primary responsibility of Boeing is to build really good airplanes, and you want to get the best people to build those good airplanes, and maybe not be so concerned about the gender of the people designing the airplanes or the race of the people building them, and so forth. Yeah, I think that's a salutary turn.
Yeah, it's, we just, I think everybody's had that thought, when they get on an airplane, they're like, man, I hope the diversity hire is not the one in charge of this airplane, or the one who attached the landing gear, and that it was just the most highly qualified person, whoever it may be.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
we don't all end up risking our lives here. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this time, Dr. Hall, and thank you for writing these two books. Well, you've written many more, but the two that I've read, and I got the list of them here, and so I'm definitely gonna pick another one out and give it a read, because I am much better for it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, you have a Merry Christmas, and blessings your way.
All right. Same for you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.